The storm was already closing in when I passed the last sign of cell reception. The bars on my phone dropped from 1 to none without warning, and the screen dimmed as if it had given up trying. Snow hit the windshield in thick, wet clumps, dragged sideways by the wind. The road ahead narrowed until it felt less like a road and more like a suggestion of one, marked only by wooden posts half buried in white. I kept both hands on the wheel and drove slower than I wanted to. Winter duty in the northern section of the park was never comfortable, but this was worse than I'd expected. Visibility was down to maybe 30 feet. The forest on either side of the road was reduced to dark shapes pressing in close, their branches bowing under the weight of fresh snow. The radio crackled as I crossed the park boundary. Station 12. Copy. Static swallowed the rest. I tapped the side of the unit once. The signal didn't come back. By the time the ranger station emerged from the storm, I was already tense in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The building sat in a small clearing, squat and rectangular, its concrete walls stained and weathered. A single exterior light burned above the entrance, throwing a weak yellow circle onto the snow-covered ground. Another truck was parked out front, engine running. Mark, the ranger I was relieving, stood by the door with his collar pulled up around his face. He looked tired. Everyone did by the end of a winter rotation. "Thought you weren't going to make it," he said as I stepped out of my truck. The wind tore the words from his mouth and carried them away. "Road's a mess," I replied. He nodded. "It'll get worse. Forecast says this system's sticking around." Inside, the station felt warmer than it looked. Not cozy, just functional. The heater rattled softly in the corner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A long desk sat beneath the front windows, cluttered with logbooks, binders, and a dented coffee maker that had seen better decades. Maps covered most of the walls. Trail routes, elevation charts, emergency evacuation lines drawn and redrawn over the years. It was an old station, but it was maintained. Everything had a place. Mark ran through the handoff quickly. Generator checks, fuel reserves, emergency supplies, snowmobile in the rear shed if I needed it. His voice was steady, practiced. "The radio's been acting up," he said, gesturing toward the unit on the desk. "Stick to channel 3. If it drops, log it. Headquarters knows the weather's bad." I nodded and wrote it down. He shrugged into his jacket and grabbed his bag. "That's about it. 2 weeks of quiet if you're lucky." "Lucky," I repeated. Mark hesitated at the door, glanced back into the room, then shook his head like he'd forgotten something and decided it wasn't important. He pulled the door open, letting a blast of snow and wind rush inside, and stepped out. I watched through the window as his truck disappeared down the road, taillights swallowed by the storm almost immediately. When I locked the door behind him, the sound echoed louder than it should have. The first thing I did was walk the building. Front door, back door, windows, everything solid. The exterior lights cast long, empty shadows across the snow. Beyond that, nothing was visible. The station felt smaller without another person in it. I set my bag down in the bunk room, then went back to the main area to start the evening log. Time, temperature, wind speed, visibility, poor. I wrote it all down in neat, careful lines. That was when I noticed the sheet of paper on the wall. It was laminated and pinned beside one of the trail maps, slightly crooked. 7 lines of text, numbered. No title, no explanation. Rules. I stepped closer and read them, standing there with my pen still in my hand. Do not open the station door between sunset and sunrise. If someone knocks, acknowledge it over the radio only. That made sense, I thought. Safety, wildlife, drunk hikers. Only use the Park Service radio on channel 3. If another channel becomes active, do not respond. Standard protocol. Avoid interference. Nothing unusual. If the wind stops completely, remain inside and turn off all exterior lights. Do not look outside until the wind returns. That one gave me pause, but only for a moment. Severe weather guidelines, maybe. Whiteout conditions could play tricks on depth perception. Never approach the old fire lookout tower at night. It is not part of your patrol route anymore. Outdated infrastructure. Liability issue. If you hear your name over the radio, do not answer, even if the voice sounds familiar. I frowned at that, then moved on. Do not leave the station after midnight unless instructed by headquarters. Any other request is not authorized. Curfew. Fair enough. If you feel like you are being watched, log the time, but do not investigate. That one I almost laughed at. I read through the list once more, faster this time, then stepped back. The rules felt less like warnings and more like the accumulated result of years of minor incidents, rewritten and formalized until they sounded stranger than they probably were. Every station had its quirks. This one just happened to write them down. I went back to my work. Dinner was uneventful. I heated something canned, ate standing up, and rinsed the dish in the small sink. The storm outside continued without pause, wind driving snow hard enough to rattle the window frames. At 8, I did a routine radio check. Static answered me. I logged it and moved on. By 9, the station had settled into a steady rhythm. Heater humming, lights constant, wind relentless. I checked the exterior lights one last time, then turned in for the night shift, sitting at the desk with a book I barely paid attention to. The rules stayed on the wall behind me, out of sight. Nothing happened. No calls, no knocks, no sudden changes. Just the sound of the storm and the slow passage of time. The kind of night you forgot as soon as it ended. By the time I finally lay down in the bunk, the boredom was almost comforting. I fell asleep thinking that the next 2 weeks would be exactly like this. Cold, quiet, uneventful. I woke to the sound of wind pressing against the station. Not gusts, not sudden bursts, just pressure, steady and continuous, like something leaning its weight against the walls and refusing to move. The heater cycled on and off, the pipes ticking softly in response. For a moment, I lay still, listening, trying to decide whether I'd actually slept or just drifted. The clock on the wall read 1:12 a.m. I swung my legs out of the bunk and pulled on my boots. The floor was cold through the soles. Outside, the storm hadn't let up. Snow scraped along the windows in dull, repetitive bursts. The sound had a rhythm to it, almost mechanical, and I found myself counting the seconds between stronger gusts without meaning to. At the desk, the radio sat where I'd left it, the indicator light steady on channel 3. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd set up earlier. It tasted burnt and thin, but it did the job. I logged the time and stepped closer to the window. Visibility was still bad. The beam from the exterior lights vanished almost immediately into the snowfall. Beyond that, nothing. The forest might as well not have existed. The radio crackled. I turned toward it instantly, hand hovering just above the controls. 12. Static. The voice cut out before I could make out anything useful. I waited, listening to the low hiss that followed. Nothing else came through. I noted the disturbance in the logbook and forced myself to sit back down. Weather like this played havoc with signals. I'd been warned about that. Still, I kept glancing at the radio, half expecting it to come alive again. It didn't. The next hour passed slowly. I checked the generator, walked the perimeter of the station from the inside, inspecting windows and doors. Everything held. The wind outside remained constant, never rising or falling, just present. When the radio crackled again, it was sharper this time, short, abrupt, like someone keying a mic and letting go immediately. Then, underneath it, something else. A burst of sound spilled through the speaker, distorted and thin. Not static, not quite a voice either. It lasted no more than 2 seconds before the radio snapped back to silence. I stared at the unit. The channel indicator flickered. It wasn't on channel 3. It had shifted, just slightly, resting between markings, like the dial had been nudged by an unseen hand. I didn't touch it. The rules on the wall came back to me, not as words, but as an impression, the idea of them. I reached out, adjusted the dial back to channel 3, and sat on my hands. If another channel became active, do not respond. I waited. The radio stayed quiet. I told myself it was interference. Atmospheric conditions. Equipment older than it looked. None of that required a response. I logged the incident and moved on, though my attention never fully left the desk after that. Sometime later, 2:03 according to the clock, I heard the sound. At first, I thought it was part of the storm. Snow hitting something solid, a branch snapping under weight. Then it happened again. 3 dull impacts, spaced evenly apart. Not close, not loud. Somewhere outside the station, beyond the reach of the lights. I stood slowly. The sound came again, softer this time. More distant, like something striking wood with no real force behind it. I walked to the front door and rested my hand against the cold metal, feeling the vibration of the wind through it. I didn't open it. I didn't reach for the handle. I listened. Nothing followed. The silence after felt heavier than the sound itself. The storm continued, but my awareness narrowed, focusing on the space just beyond the walls. I stepped back and returned to the desk, unsettled but not alarmed. Wildlife, I told myself. Snow-laden branches falling, old structures settling under pressure. I took another sip of coffee and grimaced. The wind stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't taper off. It stopped. The sudden absence of sound was immediate and total, like someone had closed a door on the world. The heater's hum became unbearably loud in comparison. I froze, cup halfway to my mouth. I waited for the wind to return. It didn't. The station felt wrong without it, like a held breath that went on too long. I became acutely aware of the lights, of how brightly the exterior flood lamp must be cutting into the darkness outside. Without thinking, I reached for the switch panel and flipped the exterior lights off. The darkness beyond the windows deepened instantly. A second later, I realized what I'd done. I stood there, staring at my own reflection in the glass, heart beating faster now. The rules surfaced again, clearer this time, the words attaching themselves to the situation instead of existing as abstract instructions. If the wind stops completely, remain inside and turn off all exterior lights. Do not look outside until the wind returns. I took a step back from the window. The stillness outside continued for several long seconds. 10, 15. I counted without meaning to. My skin prickled with the sense that something had shifted, though nothing had visibly changed. Then, just as abruptly as it had stopped, the wind came back. It hit the station hard enough to make the walls shudder. Snow resumed its assault on the windows. The familiar noise rushed in, filling the silence like water poured into a vacuum. I exhaled, realizing only then that I'd been holding my breath. I turned the exterior lights back on and waited for the unease to fade. It didn't. Not completely. I sat back down at the desk and stared at the logbook without writing anything. My thoughts kept circling back to the laminated sheet on the wall, to the way the rules had lined up, one after another, with things that had actually happened. I stood and crossed the room. This time, I read them slowly, not skimming, not dismissing. They didn't feel theoretical anymore. They felt observational, like someone had written them after watching the same things happen enough times to stop questioning why. I finished reading and stepped back. The station was quiet again, the radio silent, the storm outside relentless and familiar once more. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. No more sounds, no more signals, no more moments of wrongness. By the time the sky outside began to lighten imperceptibly with the approach of dawn, I found myself wishing something would happen, anything, to break the tension that had settled in my chest. Instead, the night ended the way it had begun, cold, isolated, and just unsettling enough that I couldn't fully relax. When I finally lay back down, I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening to the wind, thinking about rules that no longer felt like jokes. By the third night, the storm had settled into something predictable. The wind was still there, constant, heavy, but it no longer surged or snapped. It pressed against the station in a steady, unbroken flow. Snow accumulated faster than it could slide off the roof, piling up along the base of the walls and against the windowsills. The world outside had narrowed to the same 30 feet in every direction, unchanged no matter how long I looked. Predictable should have been comforting. It wasn't. I sat at the desk with the logbook open, pen resting across the page without touching it. The radio hissed softly on channel 3, a low background sound I'd stopped consciously noticing sometime after midnight. I checked the clock. 12:41 a.m. That was when the hiss changed. Not louder, not quieter, cleaner. The static thinned out, resolving into a clearer signal as if someone had adjusted a dial with deliberate care. I straightened in my chair, eyes fixed on the radio. "Station 12, a voice said. I didn't move. The voice was calm, measured, professional. It had the clipped cadence of Park Service training, the kind of tone you used when giving directions over bad reception or reporting conditions during an incident. No panic, no distortion beyond the faint grain of radio compression. "Station 12, do you copy?" My hand hovered over the logbook. This wasn't like before. This wasn't a burst of interference or a half-formed sound. This was a proper transmission, clean enough that I could hear the breath between words. I leaned closer to the radio without touching it. "This is Ranger Operations," the voice continued. "We're seeing unusual readings on your end. Can you confirm status?" Ranger Operations. That phrase hit a part of my brain trained to respond. I'd heard it 100 times during drills and real calls alike. It carried authority by design. I opened my mouth, then stopped. "Only use the Park Service radio on channel 3. If another channel becomes active, do not respond." The channel indicator glowed steadily where it should. Channel 3. No flicker. No drift. I hesitated, then checked the logbook instead of the radio. The last confirmed transmission from headquarters was hours old. No mention of monitoring anomalies. No scheduled check-in at this time. "Station 12, the voice said again, patient now. "We're picking up intermittent signal loss. Just need a verbal." I wrote down the time. 12:43 a.m. Clear transmission received. Source unconfirmed. The pen scratched louder than it should have. I didn't respond. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the voice returned, unchanged in tone. "If you're experiencing technical issues, note them in your log. Weather's affecting more than just your sector." That detail made my stomach tighten. Logging issues was standard procedure. Everyone knew that. Still, the way the voice said it felt less like instruction and more like commentary, like it was watching what I was doing. I stayed silent. The radio clicked once, then went back to static. I sat there longer than necessary, waiting for the tension to drain away. It didn't. Instead, a new awareness settled in, subtle but persistent. The sense that the station felt smaller, that the space behind me carried more weight than it should. I resisted the urge to turn around. The wind outside continued without pause. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I was halfway through checking the generator readings when the radio came alive again. "Station 12, the voice said. "We need you to confirm your proximity to the old fire lookout tower." I froze. The fire lookout tower hadn't come up in years. It wasn't part of any active patrol routes. The access road had been decommissioned after a partial collapse, and the structure itself was listed as unsafe. Everyone knew that. Never approach the old fire lookout tower at night. It is not part of your patrol route anymore. My eyes drifted, unbidden, to the map on the wall. The tower was marked there in faded ink, the label half scratched out, like someone had tried to erase it and failed. "There's been activity in that area," the voice continued. "We just need to know if you're within visual range." Activity. I swallowed and wrote again in the logbook, my handwriting less precise now. 1:19 a.m. Inquiry received regarding fire lookout tower. No response given. The radio stayed quiet for several minutes after that, long enough for my pulse to slow. long enough for me to convince myself that silence was the correct choice, that procedure mattered more than curiosity. Then the wind stopped. This time, it didn't return after a few seconds. The station settled into an unnatural stillness, every sound inside suddenly amplified. The heater clicked off at the end of a cycle and didn't start again right away. The faint buzz of the lights seemed intrusive, almost aggressive in the quiet. I stood slowly, careful not to make noise. The rules surfaced immediately, uninvited. If the wind stops completely, remain inside and turn off all exterior lights. Do not look outside until the wind returns. I reached for the switch and shut the exterior lights off, plunging the windows into darkness. My reflection stared back at me, pale and indistinct. I stepped away from the glass. The silence stretched on. 10 seconds, 20, 30. I became acutely aware of the feeling I'd been trying to ignore all night, the sensation of being observed, not watched from a specific direction, just accounted for, like a presence that didn't need eyes to know where I was. I checked the clock. 1:34 a.m. My pen shook slightly as I wrote. 1:34 a.m. Wind stopped completely. Sensation of being watched. I underlined the time twice. Do not investigate. I stayed where I was, hands clenched at my sides, eyes fixed on the opposite wall. The rules didn't say anything about listening. They didn't say anything about thinking. The radio crackled. Not static this time. A breath came through the speaker. Slow. Controlled. Good, the voice said. You're doing the right thing. I didn't respond. The voice didn't press me this time. It didn't ask questions or give instructions. It simply spoke, as if narrating. The tower's still standing, it said. Barely. Hard to see in weather like this. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. My skin crawled. How close are you? The voice asked, still calm, still professional. We need to update the record. The rules echoed in my head, overlapping now, colliding in ways they hadn't before. Do not respond. Log the time. Do not investigate. But there was another rule too. Unwritten. Instinctive. The one drilled into every ranger from day one. Report unusual activity. My pen hovered over the page. The wind remained absent. I wrote the time again. 1:36 a.m. I did not answer. The radio clicked off. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if something had decided to wait. When the wind finally returned, it did so all at once, slamming into the station with renewed force. Snow lashed the windows. The heater kicked back on. The world resumed its place. I sagged into the chair, exhausted. The sense of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, settled deep in my awareness, long after the storm reclaimed the night. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I understood that whatever was happening wasn't random. It was paying attention. The radio came alive at 2:11 a.m., not with static, not with a partial signal, with a voice that spoke my name. Ethan. I didn't move. For a moment I was convinced I'd imagined it, that exhaustion had finally started to blur sound into meaning. I stared at the radio, waiting for the hiss to reclaim the channel, for the illusion to collapse. It didn't. Ethan, the voice said again, closer somehow. If you can hear me, don't hang up. My throat tightened. No one at headquarters used first names on the radio, not during routine operations, not during incidents. Names were for paperwork and debriefs, not open channels. If you hear your name over the radio, do not answer, even if the voice sounds familiar. The rule surfaced fully formed, sharp and unmistakable. I stayed silent. The voice exhaled slowly, like someone steadying themselves. Okay, it said. That's fine. Just listen. I wrote the time in the logbook without looking down. 2:11 a.m., name used over radio. The pen hovered, then pressed harder than necessary. This is Ranger Daniel Mercer, the voice continued. Station 9, fire lookout assignment. The name hit with unexpected force. Mercer had vanished 3 winters ago, a routine night patrol that never checked back in. His truck was found abandoned near the access road to the old fire lookout tower, door open, engine cold. No tracks leading away, no body. The case was still referenced during training as an example of why winter protocols existed in the first place. I knew the name because everyone did. "I know you're new out there," Mercer said, his tone calm but strained. "They didn't tell you everything?" "They never do." My hand clenched around the pen. "Only use the Park Service radio on Channel 3. If another channel becomes active, do not respond." The channel indicator hadn't moved. It still read Channel 3. "That station you're in," Mercer went on, "it wasn't meant to be staffed alone. Not anymore." I swallowed. "You've noticed it by now," he said. "The way things line up, the wind, the timing, the rules." The laminated sheet on the wall seemed suddenly heavier, as if its presence had gained physical weight. "I need you to hear me," Mercer said, "because I didn't." There was a pause, not a break in signal, a deliberate silence. "I thought following the rules was enough," he continued. "I thought if I did everything right, it would leave me alone. That was the mistake." My chest felt tight, like I couldn't quite fill my lungs. "I'm still here," Mercer said. "Not where I should be, not where you think, but I'm close enough to talk to you." The heater clicked off mid-cycle. The wind outside began to falter. I noticed both things at once. Mercer's voice dropped slightly, losing some of its composure. "It's paying attention now," he said. "You need to be careful what you do next." The wind stopped completely. The silence was so abrupt it felt like pressure against my ears. The lights inside the station flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the exterior flood lamps snapped off, plunging the windows into black. I hadn't touched the switch. My pulse hammered. If the wind stops completely, remain inside and turn off all exterior lights. Do not look outside until the wind returns. The rule had been followed without my input. "That wasn't you," Mercer said quietly. "That was it." I pushed my chair back slowly, standing without taking my eyes off the radio. The feeling of being watched intensified, no longer vague. It felt directional now, focused. "I don't have much time," Mercer said. "When it notices a choice, it closes in." "A choice?" The word slipped out before I could stop it. The radio crackled sharply, then went dead. My heart dropped. I stared at the unit, waiting for the hiss to return, for anything to confirm I hadn't just crossed a line. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Then the channel flared back to life. Static tore through the speaker, loud and violent, before resolving into Mercer's voice again, clearer than before. "Don't answer questions," he said quickly. "It reacts to responses, to engagement. Every time you acknowledge it, it learns how to push." My hands trembled. "Listen to me," Mercer continued. "The tower, it's not a location. It's a focus point. It's where it concentrates. If you go there..." The radio shrieked. A burst of feedback slammed through the speaker, forcing me to flinch back. The lights inside the station dimmed, then surged bright enough to sting my eyes. "Ethan," Mercer said urgently, "you need to stay inside, no matter what it asks you to do." The words overlapped with another thought, one that rose unbidden and heavy. "Do not leave the station after midnight unless instructed by headquarters." "I broke that rule," Mercer said, as if responding to my thoughts. "I told myself it was just protocol, that I was being overly cautious. I stepped outside because I thought I heard someone calling for help." The floor creaked beneath my feet. "I was wrong," he said. The silence outside pressed closer, as if the darkness itself were leaning in. "You're not wrong yet," Mercer said. "You still have time." I should have stayed quiet. I knew that. Every rule I'd read, every instinct sharpened by the last few nights, told me to let the transmission end on its own. But the idea of silence, of being left alone with whatever was listening, felt worse. "What do?" I asked. The moment the words left my mouth, the station reacted. The radio surged with sound, layers of static folding over each other in rapid bursts. The interior lights flickered violently. Somewhere above me, something struck the roof, once hard enough to send a vibration through the beams. Mercer's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and alarmed. "No," he said. "You shouldn't have." The exterior lights flashed back on for a split second, illuminating nothing but swirling snow, then went out again permanently. The wind remained gone. Complete, unnatural stillness filled the space around the station. I backed away from the desk, heart racing, every sense on high alert. The door stood where it always had, solid and closed, but I felt a pull toward it all the same. A compulsion, sudden and overwhelming, to step outside, to move, to do something. The rule echoed in my head, louder than the rest. Do not leave the station after midnight. I planted my feet and forced myself to stay still. The radio crackled one last time. "It knows you now," Mercer said softly. "It knows you'll answer." Then the channel went silent. The lights stabilized. The heater remained off. The wind did not return. I stood there in the dark, breathing hard, understanding settling in with sickening clarity. The rules weren't there to keep things from happening. They were there to limit how much choice you had. And I had just made one. After the radio went silent, nothing replaced it. No hiss, no background static, no wind pressing against the walls. The absence of sound was complete enough that it took a moment to register as wrong. I stood where I was, breathing shallowly, waiting for something, anything, to confirm that the station still existed in the world I knew. It didn't. The heater stayed off. The lights held steady but felt too bright against the stillness. Outside the windows, the darkness was flat and unmoving, as if the storm had been erased rather than paused. I sat down at the desk because my legs no longer trusted themselves. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second distinct. I watched the hand move, then looked away, then checked again. The time hadn't advanced the way I expected it to. Or maybe it had, and my sense of it was slipping. I didn't know. I kept my hands folded in front of me, fingers locked together to stop them from shaking. The urge to do something, to check the door, to look outside, to turn the radio on and off just to prove it still worked, sat heavy in my chest. I didn't give in to it. The rules had narrowed my options to one thing: wait. So I waited. Minutes passed. Or maybe they didn't. Without the wind, the night had lost its rhythm. There were no changes to mark the passage of time, no cycles, no cues, just the ticking clock and my own breathing. I started to doubt myself. Maybe the storm really had passed. Maybe this was just the calm that came afterward, and I was letting the last few nights get to me. Maybe Mercer hadn't been real. Maybe exhaustion had pulled an old name out of memory and given it a voice. But doubt didn't explain the way the silence pressed in. It felt deliberate, maintained. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, immediately regretting it. With my vision gone, the sense of presence sharpened. Not a shape, not a sound, just the certainty that I wasn't alone in my own head. I opened my eyes again and fixed them on the opposite wall. The logbook lay open beside me. I picked up the pen and stared at the last entry I'd written. 2:11 a.m., name used over radio. Below it, the next line. 2-response given. I hadn't written the time. I couldn't remember exactly when I'd spoken. That bothered me more than the fact that I had. I added another entry. Feeling of being observed persists. I stopped myself before writing anything else. The rule hadn't said to describe the feeling, just to log the time. I crossed out the sentence and wrote the hour instead. I listened. Nothing answered. At some point, my thoughts turned inward, circling the same questions without finding purchase. Had I misheard the rule? Had it said never respond, or just don't answer your name? Had the channel actually shifted? Had the lights gone out on their own, or had I missed the moment my hand moved? The doubts stacked up, one on top of another, each undermining the certainty of the last few nights. I hated that more than the fear. Fear was simple. Doubt wasn't. I felt foolish for talking to the radio, for engaging at all. The rules hadn't promised safety. They'd promised boundaries. And I'd crossed one because I thought I understood the situation better than whoever had written them. That arrogance sat heavy now. The chair creaked softly when I shifted my weight. The sound seemed unnaturally loud. I froze, listening for an echo that didn't come. The station remained sealed and quiet. I checked the clock again. It read 4:02 a.m. That couldn't be right. I was sure it had been after 2 when the radio fell silent. I'd been sitting here longer than that, or I felt like I had. My body ached with the sense of hours passed, but the clock insisted otherwise. I stood up and walked the room slowly, careful with each step. I checked the doors again without touching the handles, looked at the windows without approaching them. Everything was unchanged. That was the problem. The feeling of being watched intensified as the night dragged on. It wasn't directional anymore. It felt ambient, woven into the space like humidity, as if the station itself were aware of me, tracking my movements, noting my hesitation. I sat back down and forced myself to remain still. If it reacts to engagement, Mercer had said, so I gave it none. Time stretched thin. The clock crept forward in uneven increments. Sometimes the second hand seemed to stall. Other times it jumped. I stopped trying to count. When the radio finally spoke again, it did so without warning. "Logging correct," the voice said. I jolted, breath catching painfully in my throat. The sound was clean, controlled, familiar in the way Mercer's voice had been, but stripped of urgency, stripped of emotion, just professional. "It's almost morning," the voice continued. "You've done well." I didn't respond. The radio remained on channel 3. The indicator glowed steadily, reassuring in a way that felt intentional. "You stayed inside," the voice said. "You limited your choices." The clock ticked behind me. "The rules aren't meant to protect you," the voice went on, calm and matter of fact. "They're meant to reduce variability." My skin prickled. "People make mistakes when they have options," it said. "You followed the structure. That's why you're still here." Still here. The phrase settled uncomfortably. "Dawn will come," the voice said. "The station will resume normal function. You'll leave when instructed, and you won't talk about this in ways that matter." I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. "Some stay," the voice added, almost casually. "Most don't. The difference isn't belief, it's compliance." The radio clicked once, then went silent again. This time, the wind returned. Not all at once. It crept back in, a low murmur at first, then the familiar rush of air and snow against the walls. The heater kicked on. The station exhaled, systems resuming their expected rhythms. The world slid back into place as if it had never left. I stayed seated until the sky outside began to lighten, a faint gray seeping into the darkness beyond the windows. Only then did I allow myself to breathe fully. I'd made it to morning, whatever that meant now. Morning came without ceremony. The storm thinned out gradually, the wind losing its edge, the snow falling straight down instead of sideways. By the time the sun rose far enough to lighten the sky beyond the windows, the station looked almost peaceful, quiet, ordinary. The heater hummed. The lights behaved. The radio sat silent on the desk, exactly where it always had. If I hadn't been there through the night, I would have thought nothing unusual had happened at all. At 7:04 a.m., headlights appeared through the thinning snowfall. A truck pulled into the clearing, tires crunching over compacted snow. The engine cut. A door opened and closed. Footsteps approached the station with unhurried confidence. I watched from the window as the new ranger, Sarah, according to the schedule, knocked once, firmly, like someone who expected a normal response. It took me a second to move. I unlocked the door and opened it. the cold air rushing in along with the sound of the world returning to itself. Sarah smiled briefly when she saw me. "Rough night?" she asked. I nodded, unable to find anything else to say. She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots, already half focused on her checklist. "Storm finally broke about an hour ago. Roads are passable again. You ready to head out?" "Yeah," I said. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears. Flat, distant. She didn't notice. We went through the handover the same way Mark and I had days earlier. Fuel levels, generator status, equipment. I spoke when spoken to, wrote where I was told to write. Everything felt automatic, like my body was performing tasks my mind hadn't fully caught up with. At one point, Sarah glanced at the wall. "They still haven't taken that down?" I followed her gaze. The laminated rules were gone. The pins remained, small holes in the drywall where the paper had been, but the sheet itself was missing. "Taken what down?" I asked. She frowned slightly. "That notice. They were talking about updating it last winter." "There was something there?" I pressed. Sarah shrugged. "If there was, it wasn't important. Probably old guidelines they forgot about." She turned back to the desk. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the empty wall. When we finished the logs, I flipped through the previous entries, scanning backward through the station records, dates, names, weather reports, routine notes stretching back years. I found nothing about Daniel Mercer, no mention of his disappearance, no addendum, no warning. His name didn't appear anywhere, not in incident reports, not in training notes, not in the margins where rangers sometimes left reminders for each other. It was as if he'd never existed. I closed the logbook slowly. Sarah noticed the look on my face. "You okay?" I hesitated, then said, "Did you ever hear about a ranger named Mercer? Fire lookout assignment?" She thought for a moment. "Can't say I have. You sure that wasn't before your time?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The drive out of the park felt longer than the drive in. The road was clearer now, snow pushed aside by plows that must have passed through earlier. Trees stood still and quiet, weighed down but intact. The storm had left no obvious damage behind. As I passed the turnoff that led toward the old fire lookout tower, I slowed without meaning to. The access road was still there, barely visible beneath the snow, choked with drifts and fallen branches. The tower itself wasn't visible from this distance. I kept driving. Once I was back in an area with cell service, my phone buzzed with missed notifications, messages from family, a reminder about a routine medical appointment I'd forgotten, the normal noise of a life that hadn't been interrupted. At headquarters, my report was met with polite indifference. "Radio interference during storms isn't uncommon," the supervisor said. "Sleep deprivation can do strange things in isolated environments." "I heard a voice," I said. "It knew things. It used my name." He nodded sympathetically. "That assignment gets to people, especially the first time." I tried again. Explained the silence, the lights, the way the station had felt aware. The response didn't change. By the end of the meeting, it was clear there would be no follow-up, no investigation, no note in my file beyond a recommendation for rest. I stopped talking after that. It was easier than trying to convince people who were already certain I was mistaken. In the weeks that followed, I found it hard to sleep. Silence made me uneasy. Wind unsettled me. When the air grew too still, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, an instinctive need to remain inside, to limit movement, to wait.